it goes the other way, which is if you go to Courtauld galleries or something, another museum, and you look at Van Gogh landscape, he thought of this as a work of religion. Now, what he meant by a work of religion was a work that should inspire transcendence. And we have the same problems when we look at a Van Gogh. We think, oh, that's nice, nice hatching there, and an interesting perspective. Rather than like the artist who was going to kill himself within 3 weeks of painting something, is thinking, this is my last testament to what it is to be human. And we're like, oh, it looks interesting. It's interesting orange.
Alain de Botton, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Do you think that religion is primarily a philosophical enterprise?
I think religion is at its most sterile as a topic of discussion when we simply look at it as a question of belief. So I take from your question the idea of like, could we do some philosophizing around religion to make the topic intriguing? And I think absolutely. It's a very ripe topic. But as I say, in the modern world, it's often seen as like, either I believe, at which point I get interested in religion and, start to delve into it, or I don't believe, in which case I leave it totally alone. That seems like a very unfortunate approach. I think that you can't really understand the modern world without understanding religion. In all areas of the world, the way in which we live nowadays is, if you're a believer, but especially if you're not a believer, so many concepts, ideas, etc., are going to owe something, positive, negative, but it's going to owe something to a religious past. So you can't get away from it, and therefore philosophizing about religion, absolutely.
I mean to say that when people talk about religion, sometimes it's arguments that God exists and arguments that God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And sometimes they treat it as though it's sort of just a sociological phenomenon, like it's almost something that should be fully analyzable with psychology. And I suppose I'm interested, you wrote a book about religion for atheists. And when you begin to approach a topic like that, are you approaching it as a philosophical question about truth claims or sort of a brain thing?
I don't want to limit, the applicability of philosophy to simply the truth claims of God's existence.
Right.
I think that's too narrow. And you say, well, there's the sociological other bit. Is that such a sociological? It depends how we're playing with words here. Is that the sociological bit? Could there be a philosophy where one explores notions of community? Is there a philosophy of ritual? Is there a philosophy of time? Is there a philosophy of travel, insofar as religions get us traveling? Is there a philosophy of architecture? Of course there is. So I think philosophy has not done its job when it's merely addressed the question of God's existence or non-existence. And I think this is part of the unfortunate narrowness of the curriculum when it comes to discussions of religion. That if you're discussing in a philosophy course religion, you will be circling around the question of God's existence or non-existence for what I believe to be too much time.
And what should people be circling around with as much enthusiasm?
They might be asking, what are the needs which religion serves? Which I don't think is a sociological question necessarily. It can be answered philosophically. What does the appetite for religion tell us? What are the drives towards religion?
I suppose you have views on what those drives are. I'm interested, given the plurality of religious beliefs, which seem to make contradictory truth claims, but at the same time seem to share something in common such that we can look everywhere and find religiosity in humans. What are those universal factors that you think draw people to religiosity?
There are so many, but let's look at a concept like awe, A-W-E. It's really the notion of welcoming an encounter with our finitude, which normally our finitude is a sad thing. It's not something that we want to embrace. It doesn't seem to have any charge for us. In certain circumstances, under the aegis of what you can call religion, there is often an encounter with awe, and it's really to do with scale. The human being gets a new sense of themselves against a scale which is very different from the ordinary human scale in time, space, also potentially, eventually, wisdom, knowledge, etc. Words like mystery comes in, etc. So, philosophers of the 19th century were very interested in all of this. What do human beings encounter when they encounter the religious? What bits of themselves are brought into play, etc.? Much less popular questions now, but very necessary, I think.
What do you think changed? I mean, it does seem that now people are almost obsessed with that strictly truth claim related part of philosophy. Why did that happen?
I mean, this is speculation, and I won't know. I think that what made the 9th century such a ripe century for philosophical inquiry was that many of the people doing the best thinking were those who had themselves come from a religious background and had lost their faith or questioned their faith. So this was not disembodied philosophy. This was an anguished search for something. And if you look at Nietzsche, for example, the reason why Nietzsche's thoughts on religion are so fascinating is that, his father was a pastor. He himself started off religious. And, there's what you could call ambivalence. There's a fantastic degree of ambivalence, which makes for nuance. And these people are all Kierkegaard. I mean, these people are philosophizing to save their lives, and their inquiry into religions are anything other than what you might call academic in the negative sense. And it gives the inquiry a real urgency.
You wrote Religion for Atheists. In part, it seems as a counter to the popular new atheism of the time that religion is evil and needs to be abandoned and all of this kind of stuff. And one of the things you pressed was that atheism shouldn't be where you end up. It's a starting point, and let's move forward from there. And I think at the time, there was this optimism that if we just sort of throw off the supernatural elements and just isolate the good bits, we can get our community spirit while also retaining a spiritual autonomy. A lot of people now think that atheism has kind of failed to deliver on that promise. I wonder if you agree with that sentiment so many years.
Look, I don't think that the impulses that went into religion and animated religion for thousands of years, and that no longer animate it in many parts of the world, I don't think these things are going to disappear. They are very firmly lodged in our spirit. And I think we keep seeing in different ways, I wouldn't necessarily call them religious impulses, but neo-religious impulses that religions have drawn on, cropping up in other ways, in all sorts of ways, in environmental movements, in political movements, in lifestyle movements, in fashions, in music. We're never going to get away from this. It's just permanently rumbling around. The question is just whether we're inclined to draw connections between these things and a word like religion. I would encourage us to do so because it enriches what we're trying to do. I was just doing an event here, and someone was saying, what about communal living? This is in the context of a talk I gave on love. Someone was saying, what about communal living? Why are we placing all this emphasis on one person rather than the group? Now, religions has a lot to say about this, about communal living and eros and agape and the group versus the family, and it's an enormous topic in Christianity and also in Buddhism, etc. It really helps to know your religious history when trying to investigate whether you should set up a flat share in Dalston. It deepens the sense, the resonance around what you might be trying to do.
To what extent do you think you can talk about religion or religiosity as a unified drive or spirit within people, given the variance of its expressions? It seems as loose a term as like politics or something.
See what you mean? Yes, and I think maybe it's wrong to appropriate it and say that thing is a religious impulse. What we want to say is that thing is part of the constituency of being human. It's existed since the year dot. It will continue to exist. What we might say is, for a long time, it flew under the banner of religion. For a long time, this side of human nature was enriched, deep and nuanced by thinkers who actively identified themselves as religious. So just to be aware of that. Is it actually a religious impulse? No. The William James idea, varieties of religious experience, sort of saying a certain kind of experience is religious per se, rather than no. Certain varieties of experience have been looked at by religion, lent names by religion. Do they belong to religion? No. I think that's a religious mindset, I don't think they belong to religion. Religion has simply hosted them for a long time.
I wonder what kind of experiences or impulses we're talking about. I mean, famously, if you study theology, the most difficult question to answer is what a religion is. I'm not going to press you on a definitional point, but clearly some experiences, like, you know, getting up to stretch your legs or something, might be thought of as essentially secular, you know. And so even if we can't precisely define what religious experiences are, we know that there's a difference between engaging in sacred things and profane or secular things. And what do you think characterizes that distinction?
I think, you know, I think we find things that used to belong to religion in all sorts of rather unusual areas. You go to an art gallery and there's like a walled off area, and somehow extra value seems to be in a particular zone. And we're thinking, okay, it's not a church, is it here? We're not in a church, but we're remembering churches. There's something a little church-like around this. Or people's impulses to ritualize certain things. I mean, so much of religions is about time, about calendar, and about moments that are given a certain kind of meaning by a group. And most of our diaries, most of our time things are led by the news at the political level, and led by you know, our own personal agendas. But every now and then something peeks through. Somebody says, oh, it's the summer solstice. Everyone thinks, oh, what is the summer solstice? What does that mean? Oh, yes, it's the longest day. And people think, it's the longest day. What does that exactly mean? Is it just about the number of hours? Or is there something here that's inviting something else? And I think in the most secular hearts, there might be a certain kind of curiosity that extends beyond the merely secular.
When you walk into, like, the National Gallery, they have Da Vinci's Burlington House drawing, and it feels almost like a chapel. There's this almost reverence towards these images. But a lot of the art in those galleries has been literally stripped from its religious home and placed into this like neoclassical temple on Trafalgar Square for people to gawk at. On a bit of a tangent, I wonder what you think about that. There's an accessibility that this gives to the engagement with beautiful religious art, but is there something a bit inappropriate about doing that kind of relocation?
I mean, I think you raise a fascinating thing, and it's almost weirdly because it's taking place in a nominally Christian nation. There's a lack of guilt around that. It was actually, because we're much more sensitive to ripping things out of cultures that are not our own. I mean, we're not that sensitive, but we're more sensitive. You know, weirdly, if this was a Mayan temple, bits of Mayan temples so scattered, we'd think, should this be going on? Or shouldn't this be going to someone who, as it were, believes in it? But I agree. I mean, the National Galleries are hugely peculiar. That the Sainsbury wing is a hugely, I mean, it's beautiful, but it's really peculiar. And that, you know, a psychoanalyst would go, what's being denied here? There's something here that's not being allowed to emerge. And it's really our debt to the religious. It's sort of like, here is an old, you know, the language is really impassive. Here's an altarpiece painted by so-and-so in the year of so-and-so on oil, on the... No mention that what you're seeing is the dead Christ. It's like Jesus Christ, as it were. This, you know, this is the death of the Savior. And you know, if you fell to your knees in front of one of those things and said, redeem me, you know, a guard would come up to you and arrest you. I mean, you're not supposed to do it. If you started weeping in front of a painting of the Virgin Mary in the National Gallery, they'd have you arrested. So we're struggling to situate religion within the secular realm, and our attitudes to art are quite strange. You know, we love the art, but very weird about the culture that actually created it. We don't see these things as devotional pieces.
Yeah, at the very least, it would be very weird if somebody were doing that. They might get a few sort of stares, but isn't that kind of, at least ostensibly, what it's supposed to be for? 100%. Which is a little bit strange and tells us that maybe we're getting something wrong. But likewise, people seem to treat churches like museums. Most beautiful churches in the world will probably have more tourist visitors than devotional visitors. In fact, the devotional visitors are probably cordoned off into some private corner with a separate entrance to make way for...
But it goes the other way, which is if you go to Courtauld galleries or something, you know, another museum, and you look at, you know, Van Gogh landscape, he thought of this as a work of religion. He thought his landscape... Now, what he meant by a work of religion was a work that should inspire transcendence, generosity, transformation, a transformation of values towards the values of Christ, essentially. He might not directly have said that, but that was kind of the spirit of his work. He wanted his work to be taken as seriously as an altarpiece. And we have the same problems when we look at a Van Gogh, we think, oh, that's nice, oh, nice hatching there, and an interesting perspective, rather than like, the artist is looking, the artist who was going to kill himself within 3 weeks of painting something is thinking, this is my last testament to what it is to be human. And we're like, oh, it looks interesting. Yeah, it's interesting orange. And you're thinking, what the hell's going on? We can't understand. We have no space to understand the profundity of the artworks that are in our midst because they're too intense. The screaming is too loud. The call to transformation is too powerful. I think we don't know what to do with it. So we just an embarrassed silence.
Do you think that's a little bit what we're doing in philosophy? In the same way, we take this deep, for want of a better word, incredibly deep subject material that confronts us in our most sort of fundamental needs, and maybe for fear, maybe for misunderstanding, we start talking about, oh, well, the cosmological argument fails because of this premise, and we start sort of doing that. It feels a little bit like looking at the painting and going like, oh, the brushwork's quite nice.
Which is why, there's that lovely Montaigne quote, to philosophize is to learn to die. That sounds hugely, if you pitched up at the King's philosophy department, so I'm here, to philosophize to learn to die, and then they show you the exit, right? That's not what these guys think they're doing. But it's telling you something that at certain moments of philosophy, and it's not just sort of neo-Stoic philosophers like Montaigne. It's a lot of Kierkegaard would have the same thing, Nietzsche would have the same thing, Wittgenstein would have the same thing, which is essentially they are philosophizing to save themselves, to give their life meaning, to spare themselves agony, etc. And it sounds very weird, very intense, and it shouldn't. You can study anything academically. You can study poetry. You can study poems that an impassioned 22-year-old wrote to his girlfriend, and you can turn it into an essay on meter in Keats. But what are you doing from it? So I think that the best kind of philosophy is probably done outside the academy, where there isn't that pressure to pass an exam out of it, and it's done by people who are, broadly speaking, doing it for very personal motives. Those personal motives might not be visible, but it's coming from somewhere very profound and very urgent. I think that's where you get the good stuff.
What do you think is then the point of doing philosophy? Like, do you agree with this assessment of learning to die? Do you think there's a kernel of truth?
I very much believe that the task of philosophy is philosophy is a way of thinking. It's a particular discipline of thinking. It doesn't really define its subject matter. It's a way of thinking. And it's a way of thinking with a desperate search for precision, for nuance, for adventure. And the topics which can lend themselves to philosophical inquiry are and should be far broader than those that the modern university allows for. It shouldn't be merely certain questions of epistemology or whatever. It should stretch, there should be a philosophy of everything, a philosophy of grass, a philosophy of shyness, a philosophy of despair, a philosophy of moustaches, a philosophy of hair, everything that is part of the human realm should lend itself to a certain kind of philosophical inquiry.
I think given the abundance of PhDs and the need to do something unique, it won't be long before you do have theses on the philosophy of moustaches. But I suppose you don't mean literally in that in a university like philosophy department, you have to offer a limited number of modules. And I understand the critique that we're spending too much time on metaphysics, epistemology, but we can't do everything. So would you be able to highlight like a particular area that's broad enough to be a module or a department within a sub-department in philosophy that you think is just being completely neglected by these academic types?
Look, I do think we should have a philosophy of love. Right. I think that's a very, it's a good area to settle on because that will bring you all sorts of things. The uses of the word love through history, fascinating, immediately gets you into Eastern and Western notions, fascinating Buddhist notions. You've then got the Greeks, the Romans, the Christians, on and on. It's a very, very rich vein. It'll get young people very interested because they're wrestling with these things. Every department should be offering courses on the philosophy of love.
At the moment, it's become quite popular to to claim that unbeknownst to Enlightenment thinkers that have shaped the course of the West over the past few hundred years, Christianity has had much more of a lurking presence than people have given it credit for. People are beginning to claim that the uniqueness of the West, its concept of human rights, that everybody, deserves equal treatment, is essentially based in the Imago Dei, the image of God from Genesis. Others criticize this as a bit of an overstep from the influence of Christianity. I wonder what you think about its influence.
Look, I think it depends how much you're asking it to step. So it becomes an overstep if you're, saying there's a direct line. I'd handle that topic lightly. I'd go into it, but I would handle it relatively lightly and say, isn't it intriguing that in these regions that have placed such emphasis on, the unique relationship between the individual and God, there's also democracy. But there's so many other. It's a multifactorial thing, and I think that this is where academics sometimes get into trouble when they think they need to say something with such an element of verifiability. They then either over-egg the argument, which is in trouble, or they then shy away from the argument, which is also makes things blander. And I think one of the freedoms of now speaking outside an academy is you can allow for more speculative thought without the need to prove it in front of a PhD committee.
A lot of people have said that the meaning crisis that we're living through, which I think is a perennial thing. I don't think there's anything unique about the current time, although perhaps there is, like, statistically, more people depressed, more people upset. Maybe telecommunication technologies are making us all go insane. Some people blame this on a decline in religiosity, rise of secularism, disaster for mental health, all of this kind of stuff. How much stock do you place in that? And do you think it can be blamed on a decline in religiosity? Has there even been such a thing?
I think we can say that some of the things that religion was looking after have been left without guardians, as it were. Very simple thing, community. Now, there will be all sorts of awful things, elements around community and religion, but there were some good things as well. And I think that religions connected you up with other people around something other than merely commerce or romantic bonds. It situated you within a community of, agape love, which is handy in a way. And we've drifted very, very far from that. We don't see ourselves as in any way belonging to a community. And that's an enormous problem in politics. Secular politics is really struggling to deal with that. Doesn't really know how to articulate that. But we're aware of it. We're aware of it, particularly when people head towards extreme subgroups, where one becomes aware that people go, that group, that's a religion. That's become a religion. That political movement's become a religion. Something's trying to be articulated here. And liberalism, mainstream liberalism, has wrestled with this. How come that's not a religion, as it were? And it's a big topic.
Oh yeah, I think people will listen and say that makes sense. Like, I can abstractly separate out these parts of religion from religion as a whole, but if you're an atheist, you believe the reason religion is so prominent is because it serves some purpose, right? It evolved for a reason. And if those things could have been served sort of on their own, they didn't need this metaphysical baggage and the belief in the God and the afterlife and stuff, then surely it would have just evolved that way.
But I mean, it does evolve that way. And I was in Taiwan recently and observing how people use temples. And I spoke to some people going, do you consider it as a religious person? Oh, no. Well, why are you here lighting a candle? They go, oh, it's just for my dad. And you go, what is it for your dad? Oh, it's just a family thing we have here. It's just a tradition. It's totally divorced from any belief.
Yeah.
It's like the whole of Taiwan's, not every bit, but a lot of the, so what we would read as religiosity, and this is the problem of how anthropology met Eastern religion in the 18th and 19th centuries. There was massive misunderstandings are going on about how, there were things called temples, and people thought, right, they're going to be using those temples, a bit like we use churches. Not really, I think, missing a lot of the kind of nuance that, anyone who goes to Japan, immediately people go, are you a Buddhist? Oh, not really. Well, what are you? You're going to go to Shinto shrine. Oh, right. So what does that mean? And are you a Christian? Well, not really. You know, a blending of religious beliefs into something that looks much more like a secular sort of encounter with what we would call the arts. Like if you went to a museum and you looked at modern art, you looked at Rothko. Are you a Rothkoite? No, I'm just enjoying Rothko at the moment. Are you into modern art? Well, sometimes, but you know, do you see what I mean? A more loosely held, something that's closer to the aesthetic than the religious as we'd understand it.
Yeah, well, Alain de Botton, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.